Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for this wonderful invitation. It is my honor to be here. May I ask you to dim the lights in the back a little bit for us so the screen gets a little brighter for us? And while we are waiting for that, let me just draw your attention to the handout that you picked up as you were coming in. You know, this is actually perfect for me. Good. This handout is supposed to be a reference guide. I will not follow along during my lecture, but you will find the basic core of the structure of the historical context of what I'm talking about is outlined on it. The bibliography corresponds with it, and the map with which I will start is exactly the same. All right. So to begin with, it's important for us to understand that Manichaeism is a missionary world religion that spreads across the old world. It originates in southern Mesopotamia on the Iranian side of the Mesopotamian border with Rome. And from here, the teachings of Mani immediately spread to two directions. Towards the west, to the Mediterranean region, where Manichaeism remains in existence for about the 7th century, maybe 6th, 7th century. And you undoubtedly know about this phase of Manichaean history because of the writings of Saint Augustine of Hippo, who himself was a Manichaean as a young man while he conducted his university studies for about 12 years before he converts to Christianity. And because of that past, Augustine is motivated throughout his career to write, to try to save his Manichaean friends and also to write against them in debates. But from this part of the world, from the Mediterranean regions, we do not have any single work of art that I could show you. What we have here is an excessive amount of literature, parts of which are writings against the Manichaeans, right, like Augustine's, but another aspect of the literature that survives from Egypt, from the deserts of Egypt, are primary sources that are written almost all in Coptic language. These are translations of Syriac material from southern Mesopotamia that were put into a book format and produced there in Egypt around the 4th and maybe as late as the 5th centuries. But of course, Manichaeism is an Iranian religion in its roots, and therefore its spread across the Iranian cultural region is understandable. Manichaeism existed in that part of the world until the 10th century, well into the Abbasid era. Spreading further along the trade routes, Manichaeism reaches the realm of the Turkic-speaking Uyghurs. And there, Manichaeism, for almost 300 years, finds a safe haven where the Uyghur elite sponsored Manichaean activities. They, of course, convert to this religion, and the Manichaeans in Uyghur context exist for the first time without any persecution, without any threat for their existence. And of course, this context produces an amazing corpus of textual and artistic remains that is the subject of my lecture today. But further along the Silk Road, Manichaeism reaches the capital cities of China. During the Tang Dynasty, by the 7th century, Manichaeism is noted in Chinese textual sources. And after the persecution of all foreign religion in the middle of the 9th century, in 843, Manichaeism disappears from northern China, but its converts, its Chinese converts, take the religion further to the south, where Manichaeism existed between the 9th, maybe 10th century, and maybe as late as the 17th century, most likely 15th century. There was an actual community. And then The traces of Manichaeism melt together with local Taoist practices. So all the way until today, in Taoist context, there are traces of Mani that pops up in the framework of a folk religion. So within this rather large footprint, art survives from three settings. The Chinese material is rather small, but is very well preserved. The Uygur material is the richest, and of course, as to be expected, the Mesopotamian material is interesting to us. This will be the smallest group, but this is the earliest. And art historians are always interested in what is the earliest remains surviving from their religion. Beyond art historians, religious studies specialists, and of course, archaeologists are fascinated by this single one object, the only one work of art that survives from southern Mesopotamia, which is quite remarkably Mani's own seal stone. This is a seal, a stone, a carved piece of stone that was used for two purposes. The rounded surface has a relief carving on it, a negative carving that contains an image and a text, and that functioned as a seal. The diameter is about 3 centimeters. And as you see here, this surface is a rounded surface of a cabochon that was pressed into a soft clay in order to be used as a seal. And undoubtedly, there was a gold setting around this rock crystal piece to be able to be used as a stamp. But this is the modern impression, the sealing that was made in the museum, which proudly owns this object, the Bibliothèque Nationale in France. And of course, because of the object is made of rock crystal, it is a perfectly see-through object, a see-through seal. And the back side of this crystal presents a positive image, indicating that this seal could not have been used as a seal ring, but rather was most likely a pendant seal, which is attested from ancient Iran, early Sasanian and Parthian Iran. We have surviving examples of pendant seals associated with the highest ranking members of society. Well, these seals, of course, were used in Iran to produce certification of letters or other documents or maybe objects. And the bullas that were produced with such seals are collector's items, and many museums collect them. The Metropolitan Museum of Art has a large collection of Sasanian bullas. This one is from a private collection, but I'm showing it to you because it preserves the original string, which was inserted into the steel soft clay before it was attached to the letter, and then you see the seal impression in it is also preserved, and of course this stem was attached to a letter to certify its content. So Mani's seal is fascinating because the inscription that identifies the owner, Mani, alludes to an important aspect of Manichaeism. It's tied to Mesopotamian Christianity. The seal is written in Syriac language using the Manichaean script, and it reads counterclockwise, as you see here, Mani, apostle, de Yeshua, of Jesus, and then the last word is Messiah, M-S-Y-H-A, Messiah, that is Christ. Mani, the apostle of Jesus Christ. This phrase is the starting phrase of the letters that Mani famously wrote during his career. Many of these letters survive in fragmentary condition, and when the starting formula survives, it always starts by stating, I, Mani, the apostle of Jesus Christ, and all the saints and virgins who are with me, and then it continues on to the subject of the letter. The seal is also important because this is the earliest representation of Mani that we have. And please note that there is no specific headgear. There is a headband or probably a scarf, something that is around the head of Mani, but there is no prominent headgear that later was assumed to be part of Manichaean iconography in connection with Mani in light of this seal that cannot be maintained. So Mani, you already know that he must have written letters, and of course, indeed, based on what I just said already, these letters were collected into one of the sacred books of the Manichaean tradition. The other sacred books were written by Mani himself as original compositions, as books. And you see the list here. He wrote a gospel, the treasury of life, the pragmateia. He wrote a book about mysteries, giants. His epistles are the letters that his disciples collected for him. But he did write a book of poems, a book of prayers, and he also commissioned a book of pictures to be made. And this book of pictures will come up throughout my lecture today. But first of all, let me just state that, the cultural roots of Mani's teachings are very well represented in his writings. And one aspect of these cultural roots clearly references the Mesopotamian Christian roots of Mani's education. Mani grew up in a Baptist, an Alcasite community in southern Mesopotamia, and he considered Jesus to be his personal savior. And that explains why Jesus features so prominently in Manichaean literature and Mani's teachings. In addition to that, however, the primary foundations of this religion are Iranian in nature and show close associations with Zoroastrianism. This root manifests in Mani's teachings about dualism. And dualism is the core essence of Manichaeism. They explain the origin of the universe in a dualistic perspective. They suggest about the universe when they talk about cosmogony, that is the birth of the cosmos, that there was a battle at the beginning of times that collided the forces in which the forces of good and evil were colliding. And during that battle, these forces created a hopeless mixture. And this mixture is at the core structure of the universe today. When they talk about the cosmology, that is the logos or knowing of the cosmos, the structure of the universe, they emphasize this mixture of particles of light and darkness that are hopelessly present in our world on Earth, according to Mani's teachings. They find that this explanation allows them to clarify why there is suffering on Earth. So the mixture of the forces of good and evil through these particles that manifest in everything is the underlying reason for why there is suffering. And of course, from this, it logically follows that the goal of their religion is going to be the separation of these two forces. The goal of the religion, the work of the religion, as they put it in their literature, is to send back the forces of light, to liberate the forces of light from the captivity of darkness. And lucky for us, art lovers, Mani also had his teachings illustrated. According to later legends, Mani himself painted images in his book of pictures, which was a solely pictorial book. And not surprisingly, later copies of scenes from the book of pictures and even later copies of the book of pictures are known today. So to illustrate Mani's teachings about light, Let me start with this fragment from Uyghur Central Asia. This fragment is a scene that can be argued that was copied during the Uyghur era and placed into a textual manuscript, but nevertheless it survives for us with an important teaching that correlates with what is recorded in textual sources. Let me close up to the painting. Of course, it is in hopelessly fragmentary condition. It's very hard to see what's going on here. And after spending days and days of looking at it and realizing that every detail is there, all the minor points of the teachings are luckily for us preserved, I realized that maybe I could use a modern digital tool to help see elements of this painting. For example, you can tell that there is a circle here with something beneath it. These are fragments of the underdrawing that were revealed once a gold leaf departed from this area of the painting. And of course, with the gold leaf, the details of the objects that were depicted there are gone today too. You can tell that there is white pigments, white paint, underneath these black lines that indicate the folds of the garment. These garments belong to the elect, the priestly group within the Manichaean church. And you can also tell that there is a faded set of pink line indicating an underdrawing beneath a pile of what looks like maybe fruits. And indeed, this too would be an example when the underdrawing is revealed from beneath a layer of gold leaf. So to help convey the importance of this image with a specialist in digital images, I created a digital reconstruction of this painting. What you will see is not a work of art. It's just a tool for me to convey the content, the iconographic content, accurately preserved here. And here is the digital reconstruction. What we did is we took parts of other Manichaean paintings from the same time period, from the same context, probably done by the hand of different artists, but accurately placed them into the painting and tried to reconstruct based on other notable shapes and objects that are found in the corpus that survives from the Uyghur context of Manichaean art. So let's take a look at what's going on here. Clearly, this is a symmetrical composition with a formal symmetry on the two sides of the painting. And indeed, these elements gradually lead us along a path that makes perfect sense in light of early Manichaean literature. Lay people, who are shown here in their garment, lay garment, holding books in their folded arms, as seen in other Manichaean paintings, donate a pile of food. These are probably figs. So what they donate is vegetarian, better to say vegan food. The Manichaean diet, the essential rules of the church is that the elect only consumes food that considered to be rich in particles of light. And fruit ripened by the sun are considered the only item on the menu that has the greatest concentration of particles of light in it. So this food is then donated to the elect, to the priest, who consume such food items once a day in the course of a sacred meal. After the meal is conducted, they sing hymns in a ritualized manner, and the singing of hymns allows the light particles, which are liberated literally through their digestive system, through their holy bodies. The liberated light is then sent on its way up, first to fill the vessels of light, the sun and the moon. The sun collects the light particles as it fills out, and then it gives its light content further to the sun as it wanes. And then the sun takes over the shipment and ferries it up all the way to the realm of light, to God, where God exists. As customary in Mesopotamian art and in other arts during the Roman and Byzantine era, God is symbolized here through a right hand reaching into the painting, and is shown picking up that shipment of light nicely. It's a very powerful symbol. But of course, this is all, now you probably will see when I put back the original, the actual image, you can see all this in it. But without the digital reconstruction, it would have been really hard for me to convey all this. You probably wouldn't even have believed me. Well, anyways, so art, indeed, is a very important source in addition to text in Manichaean context. Both textual and artistic representation accurately convey bits and pieces of the Manichaean doctrine, Mani's teaching. In Manichaeism, the forces of light, or the forces of good, can be summed up just by concentrating on the main actors in Mani's teaching. You have already seen figures of laity and figures of the elect, the priesthood, right? These are human members of the community. The prophets who lead religious communities are very important in Manichaeism. These prophets are considered to be the human messengers of man, human messengers of God. Mani is the prophet for the Manichaean religion, but Mani teaches that previous prophets that came before him and were active in different parts of the world than he himself lived in also conveyed the very same truths, the very same religious framework, but their messages got corrupted by later transmissions. Mani suggested that writing down his own teachings himself will secure the purity and transmit his teachings in an unadulterated way to his disciples and future generations. So accordingly, he suggested that Jesus, the historical Buddha, Zoroaster, were all true prophets, predecessors of him, his brothers. He called him his brothers, equal to him. But their message got corrupted because there was no secured transmission from the master to the disciple. So Mani tried to take care of it just by committing his teachings to writing. So prophets, this part of the diagram indicates the human actors, the human part of the religion. But of course, being a monotheistic religion, God is going to feature prominently in Mani's teaching. It's referred to as the Father of Greatness. He dwells in the realm of light, far away removed from our earth, from human reality. And according to Mani's teaching, God has lost direct contact with the earth. Moreover, early textual sources convey, in the Mediterranean region especially, that according to Mani, God, being made of light, being the ruler of the realm of light, cannot bear to see the suffering on earth. And because of that, he puts a veil in front of his face to make sure that he is guarded from these harmful images. But because he does not have direct contact with the world, God, in Manichaeism, sends messengers, and he has a set of divine messengers who are maybe best compared to angels or gods with a small g, or just divine beings who are messengers of God. And as you see on the diagram, the prophets then are considered the human messengers of God who are organized by these divine beings. So all this is quite well reflected in the in the art. One fragment that I'd like to draw to your attention next is a fragment of an Uygur era picture book that was in the traditional scroll format, a hand scroll that contained only pictorial representations. The fragment itself retains the upper margin, the blue background, and one of the side figures seated around a large figure whose mandorla is retained in the composition. Above the mandorla of the main figure, there was a canopy. You see the tassel on the side of it, and then a sun motif on one side, most likely implies that there was a moon motif on the other side that does not survive of the canopy up here. So the figure, very easily, based on its iconography, can be read as a Buddha figure. Moreover, there is an inscription on the chest that gives the name of the Buddha in Parthian, one of the early languages of Mani's teachings. But, B-U-T, is written there, which identifies him in Parthian as the Buddha. Based on textual sources, we know that in addition to the Buddha, Zoroaster, Jesus, and Mani are the primary prophets that are organized by one of the divine messengers known as the light mind. God sends the light mind to organize the prophets and start religious activity around the world according to Manichaean teaching. So this is a fragmentary but a very important correlation between a pictorial representation and textual sources about the same teaching that are well documented from early Manichaean context. But of course, my topic today takes us to the Uygur era, and this era is available to us for study and research thanks to a coincidence. It just happened that the German expeditions that set out to explore Central Asia were under the leadership of Alfred Grünweder. And Grünweder was a specialist of Buddhist material. He was interested in excavating Buddhist texts and Buddhist paintings and Buddhist architecture. But in the second part of the sequence during the second expedition, Grünweder had to stay home. And they put Albert von Lecoq in charge. And Lecoq was a Turkologist who was quite an adventurous art lover. And he decided to explore other aspects of the city. Maybe he hoped there could be some other material surviving from Kocho, not just Buddhist material. And indeed, during the second Turfan expedition, under his guidance, about 5,000 text fragments were found. In addition, he could identify and study about 25 works of art, fragments that were Manichaean. And this was a remarkable achievement because prior to the German expeditions, prior to Lecoq's findings, no one could even imagine that a religion that was only known through the writings of St. Augustine and Egyptian discoveries were just coming about at the time, so even that was just an emerging area. No one could imagine that Manichaean religion could have spread this far, and primary sources could be obtained from the central part of Asia. So Albert von Lecoq is indeed a very important character, very, very important scholar for early Manichaean studies. I also would like to mention that the German expeditions secured passports, official Chinese passports, before they engaged in their archaeological trips, and they got permission, which would never happen today, of course. They got official permission to purchase and excavate and take back to Germany, to their museum, items. And they have the passports in Germany. Luckily, they still survived the Second World War, but it's an important little-known fact about how these items ended up in Germany. The corpus that Lecoq studied, published in two of his most famous Manichaean studies publications, however, just one small portion of the objects that are known today. Thanks to the hard work of several of my colleagues, when I surveyed the material first in context of my PhD work during the 1990s, I found that the group of items more than 4 times what Lecoq published and made known to the world. Undoubtedly, the material is fragmentary, but this larger corpus allows us for a much better understanding of what this material is about. The best known mediums already in Lecoq times were the murals or wall paintings. In addition, we have silk paintings and paintings on rami. They belong to this textile medium. And then finally, the largest group of objects come from the book medium. Well, most of them are illuminated manuscripts, which we will look at shortly. Actually, this is the focus piece that I already featured for you with the Salvation of the Light. And of course, we have some fragments now. 4 fragments are identified as fragments of Mani, or Uygur era editions of Mani's Book of Pictures. Well, this is how Kocho, the ruins of Kocho look like today. A set of mud brick buildings that crumble to the desert, under the desert dust. And today, of course, Kocho is part of the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, and it's located in the northwest corner of China, which brings us to my next map. This map allows you to see the trade routes that networked across the central part of the Asian continent, connecting Central Asia to the western regions, to India in the south, and the capital cities of China in the east. And this network of trade routes functioned quite well during times when the nomadic empires were strong. When the Huns, when the Turks, the Uyghurs, and then later the Mongols had strong empires, trade could flow across these roads under the protection of these nomadic empires. Of course, they also taxed the trade, but they protected them. You might recall that during the Mongol era, Marco Polo successfully, and his family successfully managed to travel across this road because they had a gold paisa, a gold passport that allowed protection from the Mongols and secured their voyage on this route. Well, Kocho is located here in the Turfan region. I'm just going to replace that with the name of the city that was the major mercantile and agricultural center along the trade routes, along these silk routes. And you see here that during the early era of their history, the Uyghur steppe empire had its center up in the steppe, the region what is today Mongolia. Actually, the Mongols also used the very same town, Ordubalik, Karabalgasun, of the Uyghurs is right here as the capital city. So during the early part of their history, just around the time when the elite converts to Manichaeism, the Uyghur steppe empire is in very strong position. They control the trade, they have ties to Tang China, they provide military support to the Tang dynasty. But the empire collapses in 841 because of a severe winter storm and attacks from the Kyrgyz. The empire collapses, and then it takes a while for them to regroup, but within a decade, they regroup by moving to the south, down to the trade routes, to the area of the trade routes, and they establish 2 smaller kingdoms, let's call them. One of them is near Dunhuang and Hami. That's based on the province, we might call it the Gansu Uyghur Kingdom. That's a shorter-lived kingdom. And then they have the kingdom that is associated with the Tian Shan region, the mountain range of Tian Shan, and that exists all the way until the Mongol annexation of this part of the world. So becomes part of the Mongol Empire without any major military conflicts. So this part of the world is where our fragments come from, the textual fragments as well as the art fragments. And this is indeed a fascinating part of the world geographically. It is the driest part of the Asian continent, and it is also the deepest part of the Asian continent. Undoubtedly, you heard about the Taklamakan Desert. This is the large desert here in the center. And the trade flowed along the edges of this desert close to the mountain ranges. In the south, the route went on the northern part of the Kunlun Mountains, and on the north, the Tian Shan was the mountain that allowed the traffic to be conducted. The reason for the routes to be so close to the mountains is because the mountains are the only source of water in the region. So the high altitude of the mountain collects the precipitation best, and then the rivers, seasonal rivers, flow from the mountains towards the desert. So earlier on, these settlements, you see, are further away from the mountains, and then later today, the settlements tend to be a little closer to the mountains. And this point is powerfully conveyed even by a contemporary satellite photograph. This is a photograph from NASA. And it shows very clearly how the southern route is very dry today, but in the north we see patches of greenery. The northern route stayed on during the time when during the time of our context, when the Uyghurs moved to this part of the world, only the northern route functioned. The southern route disappeared a few hundred years before the Uyghurs came into the picture. So if I go back for a second, these two routes did not exist together. The southern route is the earlier route, and once that dried out, the northern route. So the map is a little misleading in a chronological sense, but not in an overall geographical sense. So this is my new favorite photo of my lecture, this NASA photo that shows the Taklamakan Desert and the rivers flowing to south. Where when the Uyghurs moved to the region, they found a flourishing agriculture. And this agriculture is an Iranian-based agriculture that is based on collecting the waters subterraneally. This system, known as Persian as the Qanat system, the Uyghurs call it the Karez system, allows for an underground flow of the water all the way to the agricultural land, all the way to the river. And of course, these wellheads will leave marks on the ground. This is how aerial photographs of these wellheads look like. This kind of an irrigation system, irrigation-based agriculture in the desert, was present all throughout Central Asia prior to the Mongol occupation. The Mongol devastation in the Iranian cultural region almost all destroyed this system. But in the Uyghur area, because there was probably less war conflict, is allowed this to be preserved until today in a much more reliable and still used condition, better than in other parts of Iran. Well, the Uyghurs settled to the Tarim Basin, and they are introduced to the completely new lifestyle. They engage in this desert agriculture, they now are settled, and they now too actively engage in trade. And all this is going to be featured in the art that is produced under their patronage in Manichaean context. I'm showing you a detail from a book painting, a miniature painting, a small painting. I'm zooming into the central area just to show points of connection between Uyghur material culture and this painting. What jumps out to you undoubtedly is this pile of fruits, of course, part of the diet, this vegan diet that the Manichaeans have, and baked breads on an elegant lacquered Chinese table, very prominently displayed. And of course, you see carpets underneath other pieces of furniture. These carpets are very meticulously depicted in the art. And then you see the ritual goes on. Someone is reading from a book and so forth. Figures are identified by name and so forth. But really, the reason I'm showing this to make connection with the material aspects of this religion. So all the way until today, flatbreads, such as what you see here, are produced in the region. They're produced in ovens best compared to a tandoori oven. And you see that this one is I guess it's maybe just taken off. It doesn't look brown enough maybe, but this is the tool that the baker uses to deposit the still moist dough, and then it sticks to the wall of the oven, and then these round breads are, when they are fresh, people line up and get them in the villages, and that is something that unique to the region and makes a perfect connection with what we see depicted in Manichaean art. We also have, of course, references to fruit and arbors. Here's an example of a Manichaean painting with arbors where grapes are hanging. And of course, felt carpets bring in the nomadic heritage of the Uyghurs, can be recognized in their paintings as well. These felt carpets materialize on another image that shows the conversion of the great Khan of the Uyghurs, the Bögü Khan, to Manichaeism. You see these figures are seated on top of carpets, the decoration of which matches with techniques of felt decoration. Well, this painting is part of an illuminated manuscript, and this illuminated manuscript contains the other image that I already showed you on the back, the other side of the leaf. I just turned it around. You saw there was writing on the previous side. And that writing allows us to align the fragment properly the way it was originally in the manuscript. Every single example of illustrations in books that were produced during the Uyghur era, and we only have them during the Uyghur era, are featured sideways in relation to the overall make, the overall manufacture of the codex. The figure's head are always closer to the inner margin. The figure's feet are closer to the inner margin, and the heads are closer to the outer margin. And the lines of writing are always horizontal. Manichaean script is used, and that is written from right to left. Well, this was very striking when I first announced this discovery to my colleagues early on in my career. And indeed, I had my task cut out for me to convince my colleague that indeed I am not crazy. They are sideways. So I looked and looked and looked and found that not far from the Manichaeans, a little bit further to the west, there are two important illustration tradition, manuscript illustration tradition that also feature figures analogously oriented sideways. I'm showing you a Syriac gospel book where an author portrait at the beginning of the start of one of the gospels is oriented this way. And now I'm showing you an Armenian example that features a combined portrait of the four evangelists before the otherwise unillustrated start of the gospel text. And indeed, altogether, I already found 46 Syriac and Armenian examples that are roughly contemporaneous with the Manichaean examples that systematically convey this approach to illustrating manuscript. And of course, there is a reason for it, why they are turning it sideways. That is the next question that I like to address. But no matter what, even if it's a larger or a smaller fragment of a page, the text that is written in horizontal lines and the direction of the figures always aligns them perfectly. The reason for the sideways orientation of images in Uyghur Manichaean art goes back to their picture book tradition, because the Manichaean picture books always had a frame of the image, an overall layout for the image that was easier to combine with a vertical codex when the image was turned sideways. The Manichaean picture books had a horizontal scroll format initially. And this horizontal scroll format is well known, relatively well known in West Asia. I'm showing you a Byzantine comparative example, and now a later medieval copy of a Roman example of a map that indicates this horizontal layout of images. Well, the scroll format is also attested in connection with the art of a tradition that's preserved from about a 10-day walking distance north where Mani lived. This map shows the trade routes that cross Mesopotamia. Here is the region where Mani was active in Ctesiphon, the Parthian Tisphun, and Dura Europos is an archaeological site famous for an illustrated synagogue. There were no Jewish pictorial scrolls at this time. Everyone agrees on that. But the way the paintings are represented on the walls preserve the memory or a knowledge by the artist of how to arrange illustrations in a way that is analogous to a scroll format. Other Manichaean fragments that survive from Central Asia also preserve this scroll format in their layout. Here we have a horizontal layout for a judgment scene that is seen, that arranges the figures on a register. And above the figures, there is another register line. The start of another scene is indicated by the shoulder of yet another figure here, conveying that this small scene was indeed part of a larger page that could have featured as many as maybe 12 scenes altogether as on the overall page. And indeed, the judgment of individuals after death is a very important topic in Mani's teachings. We have a textual source that documents the existence of it in Mani's Book of Picture. This Coptic text that survives from Egypt details the scenes that were depicted in Mani's Book of Pictures about this subject. It specifies how one scene showed the death, how the body releases the soul. It also showed in another section the judgment, how a judge is going to determine the fate of the individual. The fate of the righteous is specified, how he will attain the land of light, how will attain the land of God. And then finally, another scene showed what will happen to the sinner in this context. So overall, once again, we have a good example of how an Uygur set of images provide correlations with early Manichaean teachings that can be led back to Mani's Book of Pictures. On that note, I would like to conclude my first lecture today and look forward to your questions. Thank you very much. I like to turn towards the East and bring in material that allows us to see the importance of what is left behind from the Uyghur era of Manichaean history to understanding a brand new aspect of Manichaean studies that allows us to concentrate on Chinese pictorial material that served the purposes of the Manichaean Church in China. The work of art that has been known from China since the 1950s is a statue of Mani, a relief carving of Mani that is located in Fujian province in the south. This statue is identified securely by an inscription and dated securely to 1339 of the Common Era. It is the main image in the back of a shrine found in a temple complex, and that is how the temple complex looks like, and the shrine is in here. And I also show you one of the inscriptions. one of the many inscriptions that are known from this very site. This then is a Manichaean temple or a Mani stan that was identified by a Chinese scholar, Wu Wenliang, in 1957. During the past 15 years, lucky for us, art lovers, there is now a new corpus of Manichaean paintings that were produced in southern China between the 11th and the 15th centuries. This is a small corpus of 8. Now one more was identified, so 9 hanging scrolls that are very high quality Chinese paintings on also high quality silks. Only one of them, this painting of Mani, seemed to have been lost during the Second World War in Japan. Some of my colleagues in Japan believe that it's just hiding somewhere, it's not lost fully, but we can only hope. The photograph that I have is from a publication in Kokka before the Second World War. I'd like to show this second part of my talk, how the identification of these works of art relied on knowledge of Uyghur Manichaean art. And would like to begin with the most complex of these paintings, a painting that depicts the Manichaeans' understanding of how the universe is built, how the universe is constructed. This is a diagram of the universe that survives today in 3 parts. It was cropped for the sake of preservation. Probably the image was damaged. But in a study published recently, I had a chance to digitally match these fragments, as you see in some of the signs indicated there of how the matching was done. The painting now, in fully constructed, measures over 5 feet, a little over 5 feet, and the dense representation that you can observe here contains altogether 968 figures. They are divided into 6 sections that may be easiest to read from top to bottom. I'm sorry, I meant to say from bottom to top. So the lowest part of the painting is a region of the earth. Above it, the atmosphere shows the judgment, the reincarnation, and the rebirth of the Manichaean community. Above it are the firmaments of the sky. They look a little bit like the ribs of the human body, right? And above it, there is the part of the cosmos where the liberation of the light takes place. These are the 2 ships, the ships of the moon and the ships of the sun that ferry the light up there. This is a temporary heaven. And then up here is the realm of light with God in its middle. And the face is damaged. I was hoping to see the curtain, the handkerchief that covers the face, but we cannot confirm that. But either way, that is the realm of light with God in the center. The identification of this complex Chinese painting was helped by a fragment that was very much overlooked from the Uyghur corpus. This is a small section of a now lost composition in the middle of an illustrated page that preserves a Mani figure looking up. Mani is observing something. On the back of this fragment, we see 4 lines from a text, Middle Persian language text written in Manichaean script. It is a hymn, a fragment of a hymn. And of course, to read this text, we must turn the image into the text reading direction, which then nicely orients the figure into the direction that it actually is in the book sideways. Well, interestingly, not only the iconography, Mani looking up or Mani observing something, can be matched up with the Chinese painting, but also the scale of the figure. The Mani figure is along the same lines of the depictions of figures in the miniature paintings from the Uyghur era, suggesting that the very complex 6-layered Chinese painting relies on prototypes that were brought together to create this new work of art, this fantastic diagram of the universe that captures Mani's teachings. This is one example where Mani observes the judgment. You see the traditional representation in Chinese context, the figure of a judge. And then you see the person being judged and the evidence presented here, animals lined up, and maybe symbolic representation of plants that maybe the person treated well or mistreated. That will be considered for this judgment. And as it is proper for a Manichaean painting, the figure of one of the deities, one of the messengers of God, a female figure of the Light Maiden, is come here to intervene on behalf of the person who is judged. In another detail that I quickly show you, Mani observes a goddess that is the goddess of thunder. And here, in my last example, Mani observes one of the gods that are up in heaven inhabiting a temple. Altogether, there are 16 cases of Mani shown as an observer across this diagram of the universe. Another image that corresponds with something that the Uyghurs also depicted is this fragment representing the King of Honor, one of the divine figures of the Manichaean pantheon, with his heavenly soldiers. Well, I understand it's really hard to see again, right? I do not have a digital reconstruction for this one, but I do have some explanations. The margin, you see, the edge of the scene, and of course, you can make out a large-scale figure of a king seated on a throne in an Iranian fashion with the knees spread and the heels are closer to one another. You also see an arch tapering on one side, and then most likely this black patch is just the black paint running underneath the beard of the figure. And of course the soldiers, these heavenly soldiers, can be made out quite easily. Well, this too is a painting that illustrates a text in the Uyghur context, written in Manichaean script, Middle Persian language. This is a well-preserved benediction text that names members of the Uyghur elite and the generals that surround the king. And based on the pattern of these alternating sequences of red and black lines, we can confirm that the original size of the page was something like that, as you see here. And that allows, importantly, the reconstruction of the image. As you see here, the symmetrical composition must have had some more figures here because of need for a header, for an upper margin on the back of the page. And then, of course, since it seems to be a symmetrical composition, the image most likely looked like that. That's a reconstruction that happened long before the discovery of the Chinese painting. But in one of the firmaments of the sky, you recall these curving these arches, the 10 arches on the painting. And between, in the seventh firmament, between two of them, is the King of Honor seated on a throne, on a chair, and flanked by his soldierly angels, his heavenly soldiers in this work of art. My second example is a painting that was identified first from the Chinese corpus by my colleague Yutaka Yoshida in Japan. And this painting is also complex, built up from smaller units, but these units are systematically organized and frequently separated from one another with well-defined register lines and frames. As you see here, these smaller units create a set of compositions that altogether make sense in order to convey Mani's teachings about salvation. A painting like that makes good sense in light of what we know about the tradition of teaching with images in East Central Asia. In Buddhist context, Teaching with images survives as a ritual practice in Japanese temples, mostly in Pure Land temples, when sometimes priests or sometimes family members of priests, like in this case, the wife of a priest, is providing an instruction for members of this church about a teaching that is represented in one of the works of art that they own. So the Manichaeans in China likely to have used the painting that is at the focus of our attention currently in a similar way. So someone was pointing to each section, explaining what was going on. So let's see what is going on in this painting. The largest section, the main section, is where we should start probably. This scene shows a teaching. We are inside the temple, seated around a statue of Mani in the middle. On one side of the composition are the teacher, the elect. Here, the higher ranking one seated and his helper, a lower ranking one on the side, dressed in the white garments, as you are already accustomed to seeing. And then a layperson, a well-to-do layperson seated in front of a screen, and his assistant is with him. The second most important part of the painting, of course, is the section, the second largest section, that depicts judgment. The traditional iconography in China of a judgment is familiar to most of you probably. Here is the office of the judge, his pavilion on an elevated platform. Here are the lay people lined up for the judgment, and as appropriate for a Manichaean painting, the light maiden, one of the messengers of God, is there to provide assistance and to maybe argue on behalf of the lay people who are judged. The good places of reincarnation, the positive places of reincarnation, are seen here according to the traditional system of what is the ideal places of rebirth, these 4 layers of society: merchants, craftsmen, farmers, and scholar officials are indicated here. And just to make sure that all beholders understand what is at stake, at the bottom of the painting, the tortures of hell are shown. And here's arrows being shot, and a person is sawn into 2. Then in the middle, a fire wheel is rolled over a person. And just to drive the point home, idle demon torturers are waiting for their next victim. And indeed, this scene is identified very easily based on the garments that we are now familiar with. The whiteness of the garment is one thing, but in addition to that, there is yet another element in this garment that's routinely used in connection with deities, prophets and high-ranking members of the organization of the Manichaean Church. These little emblems, these little insignia are found at the shoulders and sometimes even at the knees of the figures. And here in the Uygur example are collected all 4 that is available. These little insignia were discovered first before we knew about that this indeed existed in China. So therefore, this was an essential point for confirming this identification, which will become especially significant for my next example, the Jesus painting, where we get to a little later today. So another important point of correlation, just staying with this painting a little longer, is that sermon scenes were also depicted in Uyghur Manichaean art. This is a stylized representation where men and women from the Uyghur elite are listening to a sermon. One elect gestures with his hand as if he's giving a teaching, and another person is holding up horizontally something, maybe the book of pictures. We shall never know, but it's not an impossible explanation for what we see here. And of course, there is an altar here in the middle. We don't know what was on top of it, maybe just an incense burner. But clearly, the highest, most prestigious position of the painting, this upper middle area, has a folding table, and that is an altar, and then here that matches with this little lacquered altar stool that is in front of the Mani statue. The icon of a deity is another subject that matches with the Uygur corpus. My comparative example from Kocho shows an Iranian rendering of a deity. This one is seated on a flat, backless throne with the knees in an Iranian fashion spread, and even there is a sash barely visible in between the legs, quite like the way Iranian rulers during the Sasanian era are represented when they hold a sword between the legs. This, you probably just barely can make it. There is a sash that reaches down here in the middle between the legs. But otherwise, the sitting position is prestigious, the frontal image, and of course the halo. Here, a trace of a mandorla is visible along the edges. So it's a good match between how icons of deities were traditionally conveyed already during the Uyghur era. The judgment scene looks already familiar to you from what I was finishing up in my previous lecture. The two men that are stripped to their loincloths are lined up for judgment. This is a figure of a judge raising one of the fingers in an alarming manner, and there is a stick in his hand. Could be a guard, actually. We don't know whether that's a judge. Probably a guard instead of a judge. But if that's a guard, we don't have a judge figure, but still have a judge. I probably should point another arrow here and put a question mark right there. But the loincloth, the use of the loincloth to capture the iconography of someone in a vulnerable condition in front of a judge is very well conveyed here. And finally, an important point about the Buddhist elements in Manichaean art is for me here to emphasize that already during the Uyghur era, the Manichaeans were comfortable to use the vocabulary of religious art that is shared between them and the Buddhists in Central Asia. Of course, they show the Buddha figure with the Buddhist iconography, but it's quite surprising to see, although fragmentary, an image of another figure that holds a cross, a staff that culminates in a cross on his shoulder. This is a figure of Jesus that's seated in a cross-legged position on a lotus throne with the mandorlas and the halos around. So indeed, the Jesus figure also has this set of iconography that compares well with the Buddhist. And this is a perfect lead to my next example from the Chinese corpus, this Manichaean icon, Manichaean painting of Jesus. This is a hanging scroll that also measures about 5 feet in height. Was exhibited in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 2011, part of the Yuan exhibition, just like the judgment scene that I showed previously. So if you are interested, you can find both of these images in the Yuan catalog from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I think I forgot to put that on my reading list, but they were there for 3 months at a time, so 2 months each, so 4 months altogether in New York in 2011. So this is a fascinating painting because it is owned by a Zen temple in Japan. Seiyuji is the name of this Zen temple, and the monks who own this image in the temple very diligently attempted to identify it. And the iconography made a lot of sense to them because one deity that they knew looked very similar to this iconography. The Japanese name is Kokozu Bosatsu Akashagarbha, is the Sanskrit name of this bodhisattva that they recognized in this painting that they owned. And indeed, their identification makes good sense because Akashagarbha, or Kokozu Bosatsu, is depicted analogously. This is a 12th century painting. You see the lotus flower, you see the cross-legged figure, and the overall composition is not unlike what we see in connection with our focus piece. Both holds in the left hand a small pedestal-like unit with something on it. And in one case, what the Kokozu Bosatsu holds is actually a set of crossing vajras, which are frequently compared to cross motifs. So they made a really good sense identifying their painting as a Buddhist work of art. For 400 years, this painting was used in the Zen temple as a Buddhist work of art. But prior to that, we have documentation dug up by a professor in Japan that argued that previously, before it got to the collection of the Zen monks, this work of art was owned by a Japanese Christian warlord. And indeed, Takayo Izumi in 2006 has shown that this was recognized early on as a Chinese image of Jesus used for private Catholic worship and owned by a Catholic daimyo who was found out during a time when Christianity was forbidden, punishable by death in Japan, and had to commit suicide. He was executed in 1612. All his possessions were given to this Zen temple, who owns the painting today. And indeed, the work of art makes very good sense as a Christian work of art, right? But we already know that some elements clearly indicate its Manichaean context of origin. In addition to the white robe, a white shawl that is worn on top of the main garment, we see the emblem. The little hat here is the bust of the Maiden of Light. The Light Maiden is used in this iconography. And then, of course, the left hand holds the cross motif, which in Manichaeism explained as a symbol for the cross of light. According to Mani's teachings, Jesus' contribution to Mani's knowledge is by revealing the cross of light or the suffering of the light in the captivity of the darkness. And that is what the Manichaeans understand under the cross symbol. And how Jesus uses the cross symbol. But of course, the main hand gesture is that of the right hand, right, in all art, and it's true for Manichaean context too. And the right hand is shown a little bit off-centered. Clearly, the left hand with the cross is directly along the vertical axis, is the prominent position. But still, the right hand is here, communicated something essential for the Manichaeans. The way this hand gesture works can be best explained as a reference to the teaching of dualism. This is a hypothesis. We don't have any text that directly explains a hand gesture in Manichaean context. We rarely have it even in Buddhist context. But this is an argument that makes good sense in light of the importance of dualism in Mani's teachings, and therefore the use of the right hand. So therefore, one can conclude that this work of art, before its Catholic use in Japan, was used in China for about 300 years, based on the date of the painting, in Manichaean context. To strengthen this argument, there is a Chinese text, a Chinese government record, that lists the possessions of a Manichaean temple that existed in the city of Wenzhou in 1120. A government official went out and interviewed or observed, made a report about this Manichaean church, Manichaean temple, and he listed the 13 books that were owned by these people and also the 6 paintings that they had. And he listed the titles of each and every painting in Chinese, of course. And one of them, number 16 on the list, is Yisu Fu Cheng, which is the silk painting of the foreign deity Fu, also can be translated as Buddha, Jesus. And that is exactly the subject matter of the work of art that we were looking at today. So for the last set of examples, I like to start with a map. This map captures the Manichaean temples that were known from this part of the world. Historical sources document their existence. The pink ones are marked here, the ones that were either garrisoned by the Uyghurs during the early era, the Tang era of Manichaean history, or just along their own territory. Here is Karabalgasun, their own capital city. They must had a Manistan, and then all these cities, including Dunhuang, the Manichaeans had a temple, a Manistan, that they used according to historical record. And the blue marks are the only known Manichaean temples from southern China in historical records. Well, all this becomes relevant when we understand that at the collapse of Tang Dynasty Manichaeism, which takes place in the middle of the 9th century, Chinese Manichaeism had to flee, had to spread out from its core root of the capital cities. And some went towards southern China, where the southern Chinese community then was established. But others fled from the capital cities towards Dunhuang and probably settled in Dunhuang and in the region of Kochou, because there is some Chinese influences in Manichaeism in this region. Well, Dunhuang is not well known for its Manichaean finds. But in Cave 17, the library cave of Dunhuang, famously explored by Oral Stein and Paul Pelliot, there is one well-preserved, there are 3 well-preserved texts that are Manichaean, Chinese Manichaean texts, which were likely to be deposited there as a result of the Chinese Manichaean community fleeing during the 9th century and leaving their possessions in the Manistan, which eventually made its way to this library cave at Dunhuang. So the one text that I brought to you today is a text that describes the Manichaean church in Chinese translation, in the format of an application to the Chinese government, hoping and asking for, granting permission to spread Mani's teachings among the Chinese inhabitants of the capital city. So the Manichaeans had to write up for the Chinese government what their religion was about as part of this request. And we know this because of the colophon that's found here. The body of the text has 6 articles, 6 sections. The text is preserved in 2 parts in the British Library and the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. The first article is about Mani's life, Mani's biography. The second is Mani's bodily signs, probably depictions of Mani, what kind of iconography they have. The third is about the Manichaean canon. The fourth is about the hierarchy of the church, how the elects rank beneath one another. And then finally, the Manichaean temples and described, and rules that the newly converted followers of Mani have to observe. Important for my talk, the last point I'd like to bring to your attention is the biography of Mani, which contains a section that involves an elaboration on the legendary story of Mani's birth. And quite remarkably, what we learn from this Chinese text corresponds with 2 of the fragmentary paintings known today from southern China. One of them is housed today in the National Museum in Nara, Japan, Nara National Museum in Nara, Japan, and the other, quite remarkably, is here in San Francisco, in the Asian Art Museum of San Francisco. So let's take a look at the Japanese painting first. All right, so Mani's birth looks like a perfectly, not ordinary, but perfectly recognizable Buddhist work of art. as if it was the birth of the Buddha. There is the Buddha, there is the pointing up and down, there is the bust, the first bust, there is heavenly figures, there are guardians, there is even a line leading to a mother. Well, previously, clearly, this work of art was identified as a Buddhist object. But my colleague, Yutaka Yoshida, reading the Chinese Manichaean text from Dunhuang, pointed to the fact that what this image represents. Mani, according to the legendary birth story, emerges from his mother's chest. The Buddha, according to Buddhist legends, the miraculous birth story of the Buddha, makes the Buddha emerge from the side of the mother. And that is shown very differently in Chinese art. I did not bring a Chinese Buddhist example, but you undoubtedly know that the baby comes out from the sleeve of the mother, and in Kushan Buddhist art, it actually from the side of the mother. But here, the chest of the mother is linked to this figure, who then represents Mani. The style of the representation, the way the figures and the buildings are depicted also corresponds with the rest of the Manichaean corpus that I showed to you today. So the piece in San Francisco depicts Mani's parents, which are discussed as part of this birth story. This painting features prominently the parents seated in the noble palace, as the text states it. There is Mani's mother and father surrounded by the servants. Another section of the painting shows the conception of Mani. According to the story, the mother miraculously conceives the boy based on purification rituals and withdrawal from society. And we see the mother lying alone in a bedroom covered with a silk curtain. The light maiden appears here as part of this part of the composition. In a Buddhist story, we would see Maya's dream with the baby elephant approaching or represented somehow. But in Manichaean context, this isolation of the mother is referenced in one other part of the painting, not just in this one that I'm showing to you. Well, the painting in San Francisco is a fragment, and here have one very clear evidence that it was cropped from a larger composition. It is preserved from an originally more complex painting. Let me close up to this section. What you see here is a platform of a building depicted in the customary isometric perspective that's used for all rectangular objects in Chinese pictorial art, right? That the sides remain the same, they do not foreshorten. They are also shown from an angle, so that's what we see here. And this kind of an approach to the way the buildings are decorated, what you see here, these parallel lines and these characteristic way of decoration, is very similar to one other of the currently known examples of Manichaean art from southern China. What you see here, I'm closing up to it, I will show you the complete image in just a second. This is a wall decorated with a similar kind of decorative accessories, and of course the platform of the buildings right here is also somewhat analogous, comparable to what we see in the San Francisco image. And the overall composition, let me just zoom out from here, features a palace. We don't quite know what the story is, but importantly, it focuses on women, Chinese women practicing Manichaeism, and that is remarkable. Mani, just like the historical Buddha, allowed women to be part of his elects. So nuns, or female elects, are well known from Uygur material, and it seems that here noble ladies, elegant members of society are featured as practicing the Manichaean religion in medieval China. You see one woman here in this palace, and there is another woman encountering some miraculous appearance of a deity. Maybe this is a chapel inside the palace and we see a statue of a deity depicted. But one other part of the painting, this is the largest part that survives with the palace, and this other part also is devoted to an image of a laywoman worshipping what appears to be a statue of Mani, because it is on a lotus throne surrounded by a group of elects. So it seems that it would be hard to imagine that Mani just jumps onto this lotus throne to give a sermon. It's more likely that what we have here is an open-air worship where a statue is displayed and a ritual is performed, maybe a conversion ritual. But this painting is the newest painting that is recognized today as part of this corpus. It still belongs to a private collection in Japan. And my colleagues in Japan are hoping that all of these paintings will be in public collections, because a public collection offers the safety and security that only the most prestigious private collectors can afford. And for that reason, since we only have a handful of these amazing treasures of Manichaean remains from southern China, therefore, that would be indeed a very important thing to do. The statue is already a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and that just underlines the importance of this material. Without the Uyghurs, we would not have the knowledge, we would not have the ability to recognize what these precious works of art are that survive today from southern Chinese Manichaean history. Thank you so much for your attention.